Should go over to me automatically.
Should do. You should be on.
Okay. So it's just my pleasure to welcome you to our second session on processing your images. Very pleased to see so many have returned. So obviously they want a bit more with Ian. Ian is well known to lots of people in the East Anglia RPS region who join with the Nature Group today. He is also a member of the LRPS assessment panel, known for his eagle eye for any processing errors. So after reminding you to keep your microphones muted and direct all your questions on the chat to me, I think we'll go straight over to Ian.
Thank you, and let me share my screen, if I can. Screen one, share. All being well, you should all be seeing a Lightroom window. You'll just confirm that that's all right? Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, splendid. Okay, right. Yes, indeed. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining. It's a scary prospect, the number of people who've attended, but there we go. Right. At least it's not still a heat wave. That would have been pretty horrible. What I'm going to do today, we've concentrated so far on raw conversion. I'm now going to be talking exclusively about Photoshop and about basically the two fundamental parts of Photoshop, which are layers and masking. But I'm going to be giving it a bit of a slant towards nature photography. Now, I make no apology. The examples I'm showing, some of them are nature, some of them aren't. And there's a good reason for that. Partly because I've chosen examples which are to illustrate a point. And it's often easy to illustrate a point with a specific example rather than trying to find one that it just happens to be nature. But there's another reason as well, which is that there's nothing special, in my view anyway, about processing nature pictures. It's just the same as processing any other kind of picture. It's just that there are certain rules, conventions, and things that you follow when you're working on nature pictures that perhaps you don't follow when you're working with others. So, for example, this afternoon, we're not going to be talking about making accurate cutouts or compositing. We're not going to be talking about texture overlays or removal of skin blemishes or other portrait retouching, things like that. They're not relevant to nature photography, but an awful lot of other things are equally applicable to nature and to non-nature. So that's kind of the background. As far as I'm concerned, there are three huge advantages to working with layers. The first and probably the most important is that you're working non-destructively. And that is the thing that will recur time and time again. It allows you to work selectively, which is also really important. You are allowed to do things to parts of a picture and not to other parts of a picture. And the other one, which is perhaps more subtle, but is I think equally important, is the ability to blend two different things together or multiple different things together. And working in layers allows you to do all those three things. Clearly, it's only an hour when it cannot possibly be exhaustive. And the other thing is it's not going to be definitive either. Once you've used Photoshop for a while, you realize that there's never only one way of doing anything. There's always at least three and sometimes more. So if I show you one way and you have another way and it happens to work for you, great, that's fine. There's more than one way of doing pretty well anything. So there's nothing which makes my way stand out better than anybody else's. As I said, the techniques are basically universal. So if you can learn some of these techniques for nature photography, you'll be able to use them for other kinds of pictures as well. Right, let us go straight in. I am going to be going back to kind of absolute basics. So apologies for those people to whom I'm going to be teaching to suck eggs, but it is I want to make sure that as we progress through, everybody understands the fundamental concepts that we're working with. All right, so we're going to start off, and those that have been to my Photoshop courses will be well aware of our friend here, our friend the Mona Lisa, who always looks terribly enigmatic, as we know. And the reason she looks enigmatic is because she normally wears glasses, and basically she can't see what she's doing. So it is a tradition that we always have to put her glasses back on. All right, so This is what happens if you were to go to the Louvre and start painting on top of the Mona Lisa. You get your paintbrush and let's harness something like that, and let's give her some glasses. And there we are. And they're going to be pretty rubbish because I'm doing this very, very quickly. But you get the idea. And you put them on, and then you say, oh, actually, but didn't I hear once that she had a problem with facial hair? And say, oh yeah, we'll give her a bit of a tash as well, and a bit of a beard. And we step backwards. And you go, yeah, that's a big improvement. Definitely what she really looked like in real life. But you know what? I think that facial hair was just a bit over the top. I'm going to rub it out. And so you go and you get your eraser and you try and rub it out, and you're left with white. And this is the problem. And it would be exactly the same if you were doing this in real life. If you went to try and rub out what you'd put on top of the painting, the chances are you would go back to bare canvas. And this is the fundamental problem. When you're dealing with a digital image, when you do something to that image, you are actually replacing the pixels. You're not doing it on top, you are actually replacing the pixels. And as a result, what we've got here is destructive. All right, so we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to do the same thing again, only do it properly. This time, pretend that rather than painting directly on the Mona Lisa, you actually get an acetate sheet and you lay the acetate sheet on top of the painting. So it's completely see-through, but it is there. It's protecting the painting underneath. And we can do that in Photoshop by adding a new blank layer. Now, there are loads and loads of ways of adding new blank layers. I'm going to be using this one down here in the bottom right-hand corner. You can also go layer, new layer. That's a shortcut, Shift Control N. I said there's loads of different ways of doing it. So I'm going to create a new blank layer. And there it is. I'm going to have the layers. I'll put the layers palette up there so you can see it slightly more easily. It's a new blank layer. You can hopefully see that it has a strange checkerboard pattern in it. That is the pattern that is now universally accepted to mean transparent. Obviously, transparency is not a color. You can't represent it as a color. Therefore, it's represented by this checkerboard pattern. Now, what we can do now, this is now the selected layer. So now we can go back to our paintbrush. And now we can zoom in. Let's zoom in as we had before. And let's now go in and put our glasses on. All right, glasses. And we can put the tash, and we can put the beard. All right, and then we'll zoom out again. But now we have not damaged the painting behind. We have written on this transparent sheet that's sitting on top. And I can show you that because alongside every layer, there's an eye. And the eye basically says, is this layer visible or not? So I can turn that layer off. And that's just like taking the sheet away. It's like taking the transparent sheet away. Put the transparent sheet back, and there it is. You can remove the background layer, so you can just look at what's been drawn. And that's equivalent of just looking at the transparent sheet. So what we've done now is we've separated the work. We are no longer working directly on the painting itself. We're protecting the painting, and we're putting it all on a separate transparent sheet. This is really useful because what it means is, for example, we can now go and get the eraser again. And now when we erase, we're not going back to the canvas white, we're simply going back to transparency. So really, really fundamental concept there. Okay, the other thing you can do when you're working in this kind of thing with layers is you can actually have multiple layers for different things. So for example, I could say, this is going to be my layer for glasses, and it's a good idea to get into the habit of labeling layers. So just let's call that layer. If you double click on that area, you can rename it and call it glasses. I'm now going to add another layer. We'll call this one tash, except with a capital A, that doesn't really matter. And now I can go back and I can put the tash on that layer, and I can put a new layer, and I'm going to call this one beard, and I can draw the beard on that layer. So I've now got three completely separate layers. So I can turn her tash on and off, I can turn her beard on and off, and I can turn her glasses on and off. So not only are we now working completely non-destructively, but we have separated three completely different functions onto three completely separate layers. So this is the fundamental concept behind working in layers. Okay. Now these happen to be pixel layers. These, excuse me, these are layers containing pixels. While we're in this window, things to be aware of, pitfalls. The single mistake that absolutely everybody makes, no matter how experienced they are, is that they end up writing onto the wrong layer. So get used to always checking. I don't know if you can see, but that layer, the beard layer, has now got a frame around it. It's also highlighted because it's a pale color. If I go down to Tash, Tash is now pale and it's got the frame around it. Glasses now has the frame. This is the target. This is where if you paint or you erase or you clone or whatever, this is the layer that will be targeted. Okay, right. So let's move on. So that's basically the principle. So you're asking yourselves, why on earth have I shown you doodling on the Mona Lisa? What relevance has that got to nature photography? Well, the answer is quite a lot, because this is essentially how we will end up working on our pictures. And there's, excuse me, there's an awful lot of things that we do which are analogous to doodling. The most obvious one, let me open this one up. The most obvious one is removal of dust spots. Okay, now you could, in principle, go in and remove dust spots on the layer itself. You could do that. However, it's much, much better to do it on a separate layer. So this essentially, now there are umpteen ways, as always, of removing dust spots. You can clone them, you can heal them, you can spot heal them, and you can patch them. All different ways of doing it. But they all now will work non-destructively. So what you do is you create yourself a new layer, and we'll call this new layer dust spots. Yeah, there we are. So dust spots, and we've now got the frame around it, so we are working on the dust spot layer. So choose your weapon. It's entirely up to you how you target this one, but I'll show you that one of the things that irritates me about Photoshop is it's inconsistent in its tools. So if I zoom right in, so Control-Alt-0, Command-Alt-0 to get into 100%. If I were to go to, for example, the spot healing brush, this has an option which says sample all layers. Okay, so basically says you are working on essentially the composite, what the results of seeing all the layers stacked one on top of the other. So if I now operate the spot healing brush, I am now working on that layer. All right, I'm working on the new layer, but it's sampling the pixels underneath as well. So I can go through here and I can write like that. So those are dust spots removed using the spot healing brush, sample all layers. Okay, let's choose a different tool. Let's choose the healing brush tool. All right, so let's now go, let's find another dust spot, of which there were plenty on this sensor. There we are. Now, if you go to the healing brush, this is different, and I've no idea why it's different, it just is. And you've now got three options rather than two. The options are current layer, which is just working on a single layer, the way it always used to be. You've got all layers, which is equivalent to sample all layers, and you've got a third option, which is current and below. And this is the one that if a tool has got it, this is the one that I would suggest you use. Now, as it happens, in the example we have here, it will not make any difference because the layer we're working on is the very top layer. There isn't anything above it, and therefore current and below and all layers are actually exactly the same. But they won't be, I'll show you when they become different. Okay, so we'll come back to that one. So dust spots, again, it's a healing brush, so we can go in there, sample that, heal that area, sample that, heal that area, sample area, and so on. Okay, all right. Same goes with the clone tool. If you go to the clone stamp tool, the clone stamp tool has got the three options, current and below, or all layers, which is, again, that's consistent with healing. So let's find another one. So in principle, you could clone that, right? Something like that. And the other one is the patch tool. We'll come back to the patch tool in a second. but the patch tool only has sample or less. So there's inconsistency. You have to realize that there is inconsistency. All right, so just when you're working on multiple layers, it's just the same as when you're working on a single layer. It's just that the results are written to a new layer. They're not written back to the original layer. So for example, if I go back to the healing brush, there's a particularly nasty mark here, and it's right on the edge of a white line. And if you've ever played with the healing brush, you'll know it's very, very difficult to avoid strange artifacts here. So what you end up having to do is clone, or not clone, or heal based on a reference line, like that line there. I'm just going to paint over there and heal like that, so you can lose those. So this is basically the same, no different at all to doodling on the Mona Lisa. All we're doing is we are writing onto a completely separate layer. And indeed, if I go back and I turn that layer on and off, you will see the dust spots coming back, coming and going. And if you turn the background layer off, you will see just the areas where we have healed and cloned. Now, what this means that if you do make a complete dog's breakfast of some of your healing, let's say, for example, you decide to do some healing down here and it just looks completely awful, all right, then you can go in there with your eraser, if I can find it, and just rub out that single mark that you did, and then go back and redo it. So that is basically the same, just the same as doing the doodling. Right, I'm going to leave that one open for the simple reason I'm going to come back and demonstrate the difference between current and billow and all layers. So we'll take another example. This is one where I would personally use the patch tool. Now, I'm not going to start a philosophical debate about whether one should be cloning nature pictures. I'm very much in the camp that says that a bit of digital gardening is infinitely better than going in and potentially disrupting a natural habitat for the sake of a theoretically perfect picture. I have a bit of a problem with that concept, but let's not go there. So in this case, these are quite large areas. We've got quite a mottled background. Same basic principle. You create a blank layer, and this time we will use the patch tool. Now the patch tool has really improved. If the patch tool has been around since the year dot, but it used to be destructive only. It's now non-destructive. And the idea of the patch tool is you simply go in and draw around the area that you want to get rid of. So you're making a selection. And you then drag that area to where you want to take as your source. So I'm just going to put it down to somewhere like that. And now I then hide the selection, Control D, Command D, and it's now gone away. I can do exactly the same thing of that large spot there. Okay. And let's do the same thing of that one up there. Okay. So all we've done, exactly the same, only this time we're using the patch tool as opposed to one of the cloning or healing tools. Look at what we've done. If you turn the background layer off, that is what we have written onto the new layer. And if we turn that layer on and off, you will see that that's what we've replaced. Okay, so get used to doing any of your cloning or healing, patching, anything like that on a separate layer. It's well worth it, because what you'll find is that it's then completely non-destructive. Right, moving on. Let's move on to the next one. So this is a different kind of problem. So here we've got a problem which involves a poppy field, and we all love poppy fields. So we've got this wonderful bright red poppy with the blue sky and the green of the field. RGB, brilliant, looks great, except in the background we've got some distractions, and those distractions are flowers. We've got poppies here, poppy there. I'm assuming you can see my cursor. I hope you can. There's a yellow flower up there, another poppy there, another poppy there. Now, it would have been impossible, not to mention I'd have had the farmer after me if I went in to try and remove those poppies, and I wouldn't have wanted to do so. But there are times You just want to dampen them down. You want to get rid of them from a photographic point of view. But with this kind of complex tangle of foliage, going in and cloning that is going to be almost impossible. But luckily, using the concept of layers and now introducing the concept of blending, we can get rid of those and make them not noticeable. So same basic idea, we create a blank layer, only this time what we're going to do is change the blend mode of this layer to color. Down here, spelt the American way, of course. Now what it means is that everything we write onto this layer, we are only going to pick up its color. Everything else is going to be irrelevant. The whole point of the color blend layer, and this is not a tutorial on blending modes, but the whole point of color blend is that you take the color from the top layer and you apply the brightness from the layers below. So you're separating color from brightness information. That's the whole point. So now, whatever we paint on this layer, what is below it will pick up the color that we paint. That's the print, that's the idea. So what do? We're going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to go to a paintbrush. So here's my paintbrush, 100%. I'm going to set the paintbrush to be nice and soft. On the whole, I tend to use soft brushes when I'm doing this kind of painting. Now, what we want to do is we want to find a color that would be nice if that poppy were. So I'm going to sample one of the colors around here. And if you've got a paintbrush active, the way you sample a color is you hold the Alt key down, and the Alt key turns your cursor into a color sampler. So I'm going to sample, say, that color there. And if you look now, I don't know if you can see on the far left of the screen, the foreground color has now become that dull green. So I can now paint that dull green over the poppy. Come up here, choose another color, that one there, and paint over that poppy. Maybe that one there. Choose a different color, paint over there. Choose a different color, paint over there. So it's a bit like cloning. You're using the Alt key to sample a new color, and then you are painting over. And I'm going to do the same thing up here with that yellow flower. Let's get rid of that yellow flower. Let's zoom over, sample there, paint over those poppies, sample. That's now, I don't know if you saw that. That is now clearly the wrong color. It looks awful. So I'm going to go Control Z, Command Z, go backwards. Let's find a different color, one that's slightly brighter, that is a better match for that area. Slightly better. Do the same thing there. Do the same thing up there. Whoops, I painted red there. And so on. Now zoom back out again. So now if we switch that layer on and off, you will see the flowers coming and going. But if we look at just that layer on its own, you'll find all I've done is painted solid color. Nothing else. There's no texture on there at all. There's no cloning, there's no healing, nothing. There is just solid color. But because we have combined a layer with a blend mode applied to that layer, what's happened is what below has picked up the color of what is on the new layer. Okay, and that is sometimes incredibly useful. A very, very easy way of, for example, of things like this, removing colored flowers in the background. If you've got a grass stem which is bright green in the middle of a lovely kind of golden field, you can go in there and turn it golden without any trouble at all, without doing any cloning, just a matter of changing the color slightly. So that is a layer combined with a blend mode. Okay, so let's show you another one of those. Now the next example isn't actually a nature example, but exactly this problem can happen no matter what type of picture you're working with. Now this happens to be a kind of landscape, black and white. It's a beautiful place on the east coast of Iceland. But what you'll find is that if you do monochrome conversions, but at other times too, no matter how careful you are going to end up with halos somewhere. They can be fuzzy halos, they can be very, very sharp halos, but you will end up with halos. And this image here was processed using Silver Effects. And if I zoom right in, And if you look along here, along the edges of these rocky shoreline, you can see that there's this horrible pale halo going around the outside. And this is not it's nobody's fault. It's just because when I was doing the processing in monochrome, there was obviously a boundary there, and the program's got to make a choice as to where the boundary is between what's one side and what's the other side. And where there is a crossover, you can end up with this halo. You can also end up with a halo by too much sharpening, or you can end up with a halo with uncorrected chromatic aberration. There's lots of different ways of getting a halo, but the fact is, how do you get rid of it? Now, I don't know about you, the idea of trying to clone along that edge and preserve every single crinkle, basically life is too short for that kind of thing. But luckily, a bit like the idea with the poppy, there is a trick that we can do which will make the job very, very easy. Okay, so in the previous example, we painted a color and told Photoshop to take the color from that layer and blend it with the brightness information from the layer below. We're now going to use a different blend mode here, and the one we're going to use is called darken. Now what darken says is take the pixels from this layer if and only if they are darker than what's below. There's an equivalent one called lighten, you'll be unsurprised to hear. But this is the point. Now, what we're going to be doing is we are going to be cloning along this line, but relying on Photoshop to only display the pixels where they would be darker than what was there before. And what's there before is this horrible white fringe. All right, so let's just show you that one. You create a new layer. We're going to be cloning on this layer, so we'll call it cloning. Again, just I don't always do this. I ought to, but it's a definitely good idea to name your layer. And this time we're going to change it to blend mode from normal to darken. There, this one up here, darken. Right, this is where it starts to get interesting. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. So now we're going to be cloning. So let's get our clone stamp tool, 100% opacity. And now we want an appropriate sized brush, which in this case is going to be absolutely tiny, because we're going to be drawing along this line, the line where we've got the halo. So let's start with this line up here. So I'm going to sample out here and just draw up that line there. Sample there, just draw in there. Sample here. Draw like that. I'm going to sample out there and then just draw along. Super easy. You'll be pleased to hear I am not going to do the entire picture, although having processed this picture, I can tell you it took no more than 10 minutes to go around every single crinkly edge. It really is super quick, this technique, if you do it right. So I'll just get to the end of this row just to show you how easy it is. Oops. Go to there. Okay, I won't go any further. Now, there's no way you would have been able to go in and clone and get that edge absolutely sharp and remove the halo. And this is what Photoshop is doing for you. If I look at just that layer, so I turn the background layer off, you'll see that what I've cloned is far from careful. It really is just a mess. It's just a very, very long squiggle sampled from wherever in the picture. But when you apply the darken blend mode, you are only seeing where I've cloned, where it happens to be darker than what was there before. And what was there before was the very pale halo. So if I turn that layer off, the pale halo comes back. Put it there. Pale halo goes away. So this is a technique of combining cloning and a blend mode. And obviously, if you've got a very dark halo, you would use the lighten blend mode. Same basic principle. This also works in color. But I just thought I would illustrate it with a monochrome picture because it's really obvious what's going on when you have a monochrome picture. So this is a super easy way. Just go there and just draw along that line. Job done. There's no way you'd have been able to do that if you didn't have the blend mode to help you. So that is another of these techniques where you are working on a separate layer, cloning onto a separate layer, and then using the blending abilities of Photoshop to blend the results together. On this image, I just want to show you there's another trick as well, and this is one of my favorite tricks, again using a separate layer and blending modes, because pretty well for every picture actually, there's almost always a need to go in and dodge and burn in the old parlance of darkrooms. Dodging where you make something slightly lighter than it was, burning where you make something slightly darker than it was. And I know there are lots of different ways of doing it, and Photoshop's got dodge tools and burn tools and things. But this is, for my money, one of the best ways of doing it. And you do that by creating a new layer, and this time I'm going to call it Dodge Burn. And this time I'm going to make its blend mode Soft Light. Now, you could actually use Overlay, but Overlay is an awful lot stronger. I prefer Soft Lights for this one because Soft Light's much, much gentler. So choose Soft Light. Now, what the Soft Light blend mode says is, if what you paint is paler than mid-grey, then it will lighten what's underneath. And if it's darker than mid-grey, it will darken what's underneath. All right, so it's a contrast enhancing blend mode. Unlike darken or lighten, which explicitly darken or lighten everything, this will change the contrast. All right, now to do this, what you need is a paintbrush, a good old-fashioned paintbrush. We want to be back to the default colors of black and white. Now the problem is, if you paint on this layer in solid black or solid white, you're going to get an effect which is far too heavy. So if I paint in solid black there, I think you'll agree that is way too noticeable. All right, you're actually seeing the effect. So I'll go back on that one. You want to make it much more subtle than that. But there's another point as well. You want to make it subtle, but you'd also like the ability to build an effect up. So start off with it weak and then gradually build it up as you go. And you do that by using a brush in one of its dilute modes, by changing the opacity of the brush. So this is not the layer opacity, this is the brush opacity. So in this case, I'm going to set the brush opacity to 10%. Now you can either, again, there's multiple ways of doing this. You can either go in there and type 10%. You can click on opacity and drag it to the left until you get to 10%. You can click on the arrow and drag it backwards, or you can hit the 1 key. That's the one I like, because hitting the 1 key just says go to 10%. And this works with all the numbers. If you go 5, it goes to 50%. If you go 8, it goes to 80%. A very quick way of changing the opacity. So I'm going to go to 10%, hitting the 1 key. Again, very soft brush. So what I'm going to be doing is I just want to do some selective lightening and darkening of this image. So I'm going to start off with the sky. I'm just going to darken the sky. So foreground color is black. So painting in dilute black, I'm going to darken what's there. So I'm just going to paint very, very gently over the sky. This is a technique you may not know, which is if you make the picture slightly smaller and put your brush outside the picture, you're painting with the very, very soft part of the brush. And it's a very, very good way of making very, very soft results. Now, I don't know if you can see, I'm going over this, painting it over, it's gradually darkening that sky down. I'm just going to darken the corners, just like you would in the darkroom. Let's turn that layer on and off. See, I've now darkened the sky down. The trick when you're playing around with dodging and burning is basically, just enhance whatever contrast you've already got there. So I'm just going to darken down that area there. Just darken down some of these lines. I'm changing the size of the brush as I go because I want it to be appropriate for what I'm painting. So I'm just going to darken down there. Those rock formations, darken that bit of rock down there. Okay. I may want to darken that little bit of hillside behind. Maybe darken that one, make the clouds stand out a little bit more. Okay, switching to lighten is very, very easy. You can either hit that little arrow, the double-headed arrow, or even better, a keyboard shortcut, it's well worth remembering, which is the X key. And the X flips you between foreground and background colors. So if you've got black and white set, X will flip you from dodging to burning and back again. So I'm just going to go in there and I'm just going to lighten up the base of that house so it looks slightly brighter. Brighten up one or two of its windows as well. Maybe brighten up some area down here. Maybe darken down. Again, I'm hitting X key, make it a little bit bigger. The X key to switch the colors, and I'm then using the square bracket keys to change the size of the brush. So I'm just going to increase the contrast in the water a little bit. So I'm burning that bit of water. I'm going to dodge this bit of water, and so on. I'm not going to spend the entire time going through this picture and changing it. But if I now turn that layer on and off, hopefully you'll get an idea of you can make some very, very subtle differences and some very, very neat dodging and burning that is just so easy in comparison to doing it any other way. So that's as a technique I use all the time, no matter how I process a picture, just simple dodging and burning using a blank layer, black brush, white brush with the soft light blend. Okay, let's move on. I'm hoping that Anne is fielding questions if there are any questions. So let's move on to this one. This is another example where we might want to not doodle, but at least draw on the picture non-destructively. Now, this is the case where you might want to do a little bit of selective sharpening. The sharpen tool, which is something that has been in Photoshop for a very long time, until quite recently was utterly useless. It was so heavy-handed, it was so destructive, and it would only work on a single layer. It now works on multiple layers. So to do that, it's just like healing or cloning. You create yourself a new layer, blank layer, and we'll call this extra sharpening. Okay, and now we're going to find the sharpen tool. It's often hidden under the blur tool. So if you can't find it, then find the blur tool, click, hold, and then it will bring you to the sharpen tool. Now the trick with the sharpen tool is make sure you've got your blend mode set to normal, strength set low. I would suggest 10% or thereabouts, and make sure you've got sample all layers set. It's another one of these, 2 versus 3. So sample all layers, and make sure you've got protect detail set. What we can do now is zoom into an image, and where we paint, we will apply a little bit of extra sharpening. And again, because we're only working at 10% opacity, every time you paint, you will be adding a little bit of extra sharpening. And it's one of those techniques that is just so super easy to use, and you can't really get the same effect anywhere else. So this is one of those pictures where the point of focus was actually a little bit too far back. It was on this is a great skewer again in Iceland. It was on the back wing, but I just want to make sure that the beak has that feeling of sharpness, and the eye in particular. So all I've done is paint very subtle. I hope you'll be able to see it. But if I turn that layer off, you can see there's a bit of difference. It is just that little bit sharper, a little bit crisper. And if I look at just that layer, that is what we have painted. Very similar idea to the cloning, except we are working non-destructively on another layer above the original. And because it's another layer, of course, you can go in and you can rub it out. There's another thing you can do. Because it's on the layer, you can adjust the layer opacity. You can adjust how see-through or how opaque that layer is. So I can always dial the opacity of that layer back if I think I've overdone it. So that's another thing you can do. Again, this time you're blending by opacity blending as opposed to color blending or whatever. Okay, let's move on. This is another type of problem that you may well have when you are working. This happens to be a panorama, but this is not, it's anywhere where you might have an absolutely extreme contrast range. Now, this is particularly true with panoramas because, of course, you have to stick to exactly the same exposure for the whole of the range of the panorama. And it was a storm over here on the right-hand side. It was in darkness, and I had to kind of expose for the bit in the middle, which means the bit on the left is now completely burned out. But you can often use parts of the picture to help reconstruct other bits that aren't there. Again, I'm not going to go into the philosophy of whether this is the right thing to do. I had no problem with this. Other people, they may disagree. So how would you go about trying to reconstruct this completely burned out area? Well, we assume that that cloud is likely to continue. That's what we would expect. And so we can actually use that cloud, but we're not going to clone. The thing about cloning is the eye will see repeating patterns. It just stands out to us as being unnatural. However, if we were to take that and we were to flip it, so it's the inverse of what it was, it looks much less like repetition. So what I'm going to do now is take a lasso tool, and I'm going to make a selection, a very rough selection of the area that contains useful clouds. So there is my area of useful clouds. So I haven't included the really burned out bit, and I've gone over onto the dark bit over here. Any kind of selection, we're going to do this later. You can actually refine that selection by using the select and mask workspace. And over here, we've got the ability, I'm just going to feather it slightly. That means feathering means just going to blur the edges slightly. It'll make it easier to blend in. So I don't know if you can see as I move that feather up, the edge of the selection is getting fuzzier and fuzzier. Okay, so that's now, I've now made a fuzzy selection of that cloud. I'm going to go okay. And the trick now is to take a copy of what's underneath the selection and make a copy of it onto another layer. All right, in Photoshop calls it jumping because the shortcut is Control J or Command J. You can also get to it by going Layer, New, Layer via Copy, which is Control J or Command J. So I'm going to do that, and the selection goes away and nothing happens. And the reason nothing appears to happen because we've simply made a copy of what was there and put it on exactly the same position the layer above. So I'm going to turn that. You can't tell the difference. But if I turn the background layer off, that's what's on the new layer. So what we do now is we go Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal. And this is where the magic starts, because what we can now do is pick up the Move tool and we can start moving that layer across so that it blends in rather better. Now, it's still a bit obvious. You can see a line down there, and you can see the fact that there's a line up here, but that cloud actually looks quite believable, all right? Except for the fact that we know that this area over here is bright, and it's now going darker again. So what we can do is take this layer and we can reduce its opacity. Now what that will allow is the bright area behind that layer to shine through. Because we're getting, in this case, it's what, 50, 57%, 60%, something like that. So we're seeing about 60% of the new layer and about 40% of what's below. And that's already made it so that it's much less obviously a reflection, because there's now a difference between what's on the left-hand side, what's on the right-hand side. Having done that, we can then just blend it in, create a new layer. Okay, so the first layer is the one with the copy. This layer is going to be the blending. And in this case, I'm probably going to use the clone stamp tool, but I'm not going to use the clone stamp tool at 100%. This is something a lot of people don't realize, is you can actually use the clone stamp tool at a low opacity, and that gives you a blending effect. So I'm going to use it at something like, oh, I don't know, 20% opacity. Okay, clone stamp tool, let's get an appropriate sized brush. So I'm now going to sample here, and I'm now going to paint over this area. So what we're doing is we're painting 20% of what we have sampled, if that makes sense. So same here, I'm just going to paint over this area down here so it's much less obvious that there's a line. So I think you'll agree there's a bit of a line there. Let's just So this trick of cloning at low opacity, just to put a bit of texture in or to blend over, is a really useful one. So now we've got 3 layers. So the top layer is just fixing over the join, as it were. The bottom layer is the new bit. And there's the bottom layer that we had before. So we've now recreated the sky. All right, so that's another thing. And this happens all the time. You'll find you can recreate bits of sky. You can recreate bits of building that happen to have scaffolding on, or something that happened to have some random stranger standing in front of it. There'll be an equivalent bit on another part of the picture. You can simply patch from that. Again, done using layers and then merging the layers together, blending them together.
Yeah. Before you close it.
Yep.
Before you close it, could you say something about how you would get to your final image? Being asked what you do, whether you combine them, how you.
Okay, right. Yes, that's a very good point. Right, my golden rule is never ever flatten. Now, if I were to save this, I would save it as a Photoshop document, a PSD. Now, a PSD is just a special kind of TIFF. It is just internally, TIFF just stands for tagged image file format. It's just a way of being able to encapsulate multiple little files inside one big one. That's all the TIFF file is. And a PSD is just a special kind of TIFF. So if you save as a PSD, then you are going to get something which preserves all the functionality. So if I now save this out as a PSD, I can save that as, and I'll save it as a I'll give it another name like saved, something like that, and go save. And we can now close it. If I now go back to that same folder, of course it won't be there for the simple reason that Lightroom, it's been done behind its back. So synchronize, let's bring it back here. So there is that hopefully is the saved one. If I now reopen that in Photoshop, you'll find that not only is the work still there, but all the layers are still there too. All right. So personally, I would not. Disk space is cheap compared to time. The real benefit of saving layered documents is that you can come back and you can change your mind. You can come back in and you can change your mind.
And when you want to use it, then that's the only point at which you, presumably, if you want it.
You don't even need to flatten it there, because this is something that has been fixed in Photoshop. You always used to have to flatten it. This, for example, this is actually an 8-bit, but often they're 16. Like that was a 16-bit. If you wanted to save that as a JPEG, Photoshop used to insist that you convert it not only to an 8-bit file, but you also flatten it before you convert it to a JPEG. You don't have to do that anymore. You just go File, Save As, and when you choose Save As, just choose a JPEG, and it will do the necessary flattening for you on the fly. You don't need to worry about that anymore. So generally, it's not a good, in my view anyway, not a good idea to flatten, not a good idea to merge.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay. All right. Let's do what. That's good point to answer that one. Right. So let's move on. So we're onto adjustment layers. So this is an image that just shows what is. Now we've talked about pixel layers so far. An adjustment layer is where you simply put an adjustment, like it says, a curves adjustment, a levels adjustment, a hue saturation, or whatever, but you do it in a non-destructive way. Okay, so if I were to go image adjustments, for example, levels here, and I were to apply a levels adjustment, so we'll just apply a levels adjustment here, a bit like that, and I go, okay, I've now done it. It's a bit like doodling on the Mona Lisa. We have replaced the pixels with new pixels. We cannot now go in and get back the old pixels. But you can create a new adjustment layer. And again, you can do that using layer, new adjustment layer. Is it under there? No, I never, you can tell I never do this. New adjustment layer there, new adjustment layer levels, or probably better, or the one I use anyway, is this little circle with the line through it, and go levels. And this is just a levels layer, and it comes over here in the properties window. If you haven't got any of these windows, just go to window and then find the correct one, and this will come into the properties window. And now we've got a new layer which is applying a levels adjustment. And there it is. So we can play around. But this is completely non-destructive in that I can close this document and then go, I wish I hadn't made those walls quite so dark. I can reopen it, reopen the adjustment layer, and then push the black point back a little bit, or I can push the mid-grey point around, or whatever. So it gives you an option to play around after the fact. You have not done any damage to the pixels underneath. You've added an adjustment above those pixels, and you can nest them. So for example, let's say I wanted to add something that brought those blues out a little bit. So for that, I would maybe add a hue saturation layer, and I would choose the blues. Okay, sample on one of the blues, like the C, for example. So that's sampled those blues, and maybe just push the saturation of those blues up a little bit. So you can nest these things, just like you can nest pixel layers, you can nest adjustment layers. Okay, so that's an adjustment layer. All right, so different kind of layer to a pixel layer. Whoops, I've gone to the wrong one. There we are. Right. Now, those of you who are used to using things like the adjustment brush and gradients, things like that in Lightroom or the RAW converter, they behave differently in Photoshop. I just want to demonstrate very quickly how they are different. So if I open this this is our old friend, the PDI test chart. Just doing it for demonstration purposes, and I go into the develop module. I'm going to create myself a new, I almost called it a layer. It's not a layer. It's a new adjustment brush adjustment. So I'm going to create a new pen. I'm going to put the mask overlay on so you can see where I'm drawing it, and I'm going to draw over that color area. Okay. So that is the area I've drawn. Now, if I were to do something like take the saturation and put it at, oh, I don't know, let's say -100, for sake of argument, I have now made that area completely monochrome. Now, this is where the two differ. If I add a new one and I paint in the same area again, let me just turn the overlay on so we can see where I'm painting. So I'm painting over roughly the same area again. And in this adjustment layer, I take the saturation. Oh, hang on a second. Where am I? There. And I set the saturation and I push it up to +100. Okay, and I turn the mask overlay off. Lo and behold, the color comes back. All right. So what's happening is effectively one is cancelling the other out. There is no order in there. You are always seeing the amalgam of the two adjustments together. All right, now Photoshop is not like that. So let me just get rid of those two pens and let's take that into Photoshop. Just to show you the equivalent here. If I, now one of the things that you'll realize is that I'm just going to put I'm just going to draw, this is just for illustration purposes. I'm going to create a rough selection around there. I'm going to add a hue saturation layer. Ignore what's happening at the moment, and I'm going to turn that so its saturation is off. So basically, I'm trying to repeat what I did in Lightroom. I'm now going to make a new selection, roughly the same area again, approximately the same area, and now I'm going to add a new hue saturation adjustment. And this time, I'm going to put the saturation up to maximum. And as you can see, the two is not the same, because what we have here is an ordering issue. All right, Photoshop layers really are layers. You apply them essentially from the bottom up. So let's turn these layers off. So the bottom layer is what we see here. The next layer up removes the color from that area. So that area, for any layer that's above this, that area has no color. You add a new one and it cannot put the color back because the color's already gone. That's the important one. The layer is, the ordering is important. Okay, so that might catch you out if you're not careful. Okay, so let's move on. So let's go back to that one. So I implicitly used a layer mask there, but I'm just going to show you the concept of a layer mask here. So this is a very boring picture, but it helps to illustrate what layer masks are all about. So far, pretty well everything that's done has been global. It's been to the entire picture. But what if we were completely mad and we decided we wanted to make a color-popped version of this picture, which everything apart from the Belisha beacon was in monochrome, but the Belisha beacon was in color? All right, yeah, you'd be mad to do so, but let's say you wanted to do that. We know how to make things desaturated. All you do is you add a hue saturation adjustment layer, and now we can take that and we can take the saturation and we can knock it down to 0. But that, of course, affects the entire image. Now, when you look at the layer stack, you will notice that this adjustment layer has now got a white rectangle next to it. Now, this is the layer mask. Now, a layer mask is essentially a monochrome picture that you can think of as an overlay, something that sits on top of your image. And it's an exact replica, a pixel for pixel replica. There are the same number of pixels in your adjustment layer as there are in your main image. And the key about an adjustment layer is if it's white, if a pixel is white in the adjustment layer, then whatever is happening on that layer is applied. If the pixel is black, it's not applied. And if it's somewhere in between black and white, then it's partially applied. So I could, for example, at the moment, that layer mask is all white. If I invert the layer mask, so and that's Control I or Command I, then it makes the layer mask black. And that causes every effect to be turned off. All right, turn it back again, back to white. The whole thing's turned on. So that is a way of turning on and off the effect of what's happening on this layer. But what we can do now is, because we know that black turns the effect off, we can get a paintbrush, black paint, put the opacity up to 100%, and now we can paint onto this area, and lo and behold, the color comes back. Now, the important thing here is we are not, I repeat, not drawing in yellow paint. There is no yellow paint involved at all in any of this. What we're doing is drawing in black on the layer mask, and that's effectively creating a hole through, allowing us to see what's underneath. Right, so the whole point of a layer mask is it allows you to blend what's on one layer with what's on the layer stack below, depending on the control of the layer mask. It's a very contrived example. Let's take a real example. Okay, so what can, no, what? Save that one. Let's take a real example. All right, this is our old friend. This is a statue. And the classic problem, the statue was partly in shadow. I want to make the statue stand out from the background. Okay, and so in other words, I want to brighten up and perhaps increase the contrast of the area in the statue, but leave the background untouched. I'm going to do that by taking well, various different ways. I could do a selection. I just want to show you that the two are absolutely identical. So let us first of all, let's do it the way, let us add, for example, a curves layer. Because we want to brighten it up. So I'm going to lift the midtones slightly over the entire picture, and then I'm going to increase the contrast. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will spot that actually, not only has it increased the contrast, it's also saturated some of the colors, and that's something that we'll look at again in a second. We only want to apply that effect to the face of the statue. So what you could do now is take a paintbrush and just simply paint out the areas where you don't want the effect to be. But this is a bit of a labor of love. All right, it's also, this is the way of doing it kind of negatively. You're painting out an effect. There's another way of thinking about it as well, which is you could paint in an effect. So we could invert that layer mask, make it black, and now paint in white. So now where we're painting, we are painting in the effect. All right, this again is one of those things where, you know, it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. A lot of it depends on which of your picture, where's the important bit, how much you want to apply, how much you don't want to apply. So in this case, what I've done is I have simply painted in white. If you want to look at the layer mask, interestingly, you can just go Alt-click within the layer mask area, and that will show you it. It shows me I've missed a bit in the middle, so I'm just going to paint that in. Alt-click to get back again. So that is now my adjustment. So I have just brightened up that area. Okay. Note the color though. Note the fact that it's become more saturated, and that's because as you pull colors darker, you will actually saturate the colors more. If you make them lighter, you will desaturate the colors. And there's a way around that. This is another of these blend modes. If I change the blend mode of this layer to luminosity, luminosity is the opposite of color. If you remember when we did the poppy, color said take the color from this layer and blend it with the brightness from the layer below. This is the opposite. We're taking the brightness from this layer and blending it with the color of the layer below. So it's picking the color up from the background layer and the brightness up from this layer here. So that has just created a mask, and we've done it by painting. But often it's not actually very convenient to do it by painting. So luckily there's a shortcut. And that is to use a selection. So I'm going to do, I can start off by, one way is to do a rough selection. So I'm going to go in and maybe make a rough selection around the face, something like that. Okay. Select and mask, that allows me to come in, as you can see, that's a very, very hard edge to that selection at the moment. I'm now going to feather that selection so it becomes much softer. Okay, and then go all right. It still has the marching ants. Now the point is, if you have an active selection and you add a layer mask, that selection will automatically get turned into a layer mask for you. So if I now add that curves layer, and I do the same thing again, and I pull the midtones up and I pull the shadows down slightly, and I set the blend mode here back to luminosity, which is what we wanted. If we look, I'm going to Alt-click on the layer mask. That selection has now turned into a layer mask. So layer masks and selections, they are just two sides of the same coin. There is no difference at all. A layer mask is just a way of representing a selection. It's a really important thing to remember. And just as you can go from a selection to a layer mask, you can also go from a layer mask back to a selection. If you control or command click within a layer mask, I don't know if you can see that cursor has changed to a hand with a square with dots around it. If I click on there, then I get my selection back. So it is a way of converting freely between selections and layer masks. They are just one and the same, just two different sides of the same coin. Okay, right. So let's move on. This issue to do with saturation is a really important one, because go back to our old friend the skewer. If I were to, it was a very dull day, add a bit of contrast to this one, maybe add a curves layer, maybe, as you can see, it's done horrible things to the saturation. Absolutely horrible things to the saturation. So again, all you have to do to get around that is to change the blend mode to luminosity. Okay, so that allows you to increase the contrast, but also preserve the color from the layer below. That's why I kept that one open. Okay, remember that I said that layer order is important when we were doing that when we were nesting things. This is where it becomes an issue when you are choosing between sample all layers and current and below. Because in this case, hunting for dust spots in a plain blue sky is not easy. So you can cheat here. You can cheat by adding a cheat layer. Like for example, I could add a levels layer on top of this, and I could artificially boost the contrast until the dust spots become more visible. I don't know, can you see that there are now dust spots up in this top left-hand corner, which I've missed, and another one there. So this is an issue we have to think about, because now what we've got is the background layer. We've got the layer in the middle, which is the one we are going to be healing or cloning onto. And then on the top, we have an adjustment layer. In this case, this is a sacrificial adjustment layer, which we've deliberately put there ourselves, but it might be another adjustment layer. Say it might be a hue saturation layer or a curves layer or something. And this is where the difference between sample all layers and current and below really comes to the fore. So let's choose, for example, let's choose, let's heal. So let's go back to the healing brush, which has the difference. So in this case, I'm going to choose that as my target layer. Note that now we can have that border around the layer mask, because the layer mask we can also paint into, but we now want to paint into the dust spots layer. And we're choosing current and below. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to carry on healing these dust spots up here. And as you can see, it's all working exactly as you might hope. All right. And that's because current and below says basically ignore anything that's above us in the layer stack. However, if we were to choose, say, one of the tools that doesn't have that, like the spot healing brush, that's only got sample all layers. So if I were to now try and heal that, of course, that has worked, typical. Let's pretend there's one there. Right, they've obviously fixed that one. Let's try something, let's try it. Why do these demonstrations never actually work the way you want? Let's go back to the healing brush and we'll change that to not current layer, to all layers. If I now sample that one, no, I know why. It's because we are blending the colors and we want to choose clone. Clone will demonstrate it. Should do anyway. Current and below, change that to all layers. If I were to make a clone up here, what's happening? Oh, we're at 20% opacity. That shouldn't be. Okay, that's what I was after. Can you see the fact that we've ended up with a much, much brighter and more saturated blue where we've done the cloning? And that's because when you have sample all layers in the state where you have something above you in the layer stack, we've actually got a feedback loop. So we've got the sky, which has had a levels layer applied to it, which we have then sampled, and then we've then written that resample back to the dust spots layer, which has then been adjusted again. So we've got this horrible feedback loop. So this is why, if you can, if it's there at all, try and use current and below, and that will make the problem go away. All right, so let's carry on. Where are we? So these are all relatively quick to show, all being well. Different kind of layer mask you might want to apply to an image, and that is where you apply a gradient. You can apply a gradient in the raw converter, but you can also apply one in Photoshop too. So in this case, we've got this is the Norfolk coast. We've exposed for the sky. The sky is all the detail in the sky, but the result is that the foreground has become really quite dull and dark. So what you might want to do here is maybe apply a curves layer to it. So we are going to, at the moment, I'm only looking at the foreground. I'm ignoring the sky. So I'm just going to pull the foreground up until we get the kind of tonality we want in the foreground. I'm using curves because I don't want to blow out the whites of the surf. I just want to make, I'm just going to lift those shadows up a little bit because I want to have the detail within the groins. So that curve has allowed us to get the detail back in the foreground, but it's completely taken any atmosphere away from the sky. And so what you would do to that, to put it back again, is you would apply a layer mask. Now we could paint a layer mask in, but because this case, we actually want, go away, we actually want to be able to draw something which is approximately a straight line at the bottom. We may as well use the gradient tool. So here's the gradient tool. It's over here, G. And for this, we want one of the black to white gradients. Now, at the moment, my foreground is white and my background is black. So the first one is always foreground to background. Then we've got foreground to transparent, and then so-called black to white. So let's choose the foreground to background, because this will make us think. It is a white to black. So if you think about the way that gradients work, before where you start will end up as the first color, after where you stop will end up as the second color. And what you have in between will end up being the gradient between. So in this case, we want to apply white to the area which is the foreground here, and we want black to be applied to the sky, because we don't want the curves layer to be applied to the sky. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw my curve, and I'm going to draw it upwards because we happen to be going white to black. If we were going black to white, we would be drawing it top to bottom. So in this case, I'm going to hold the shift key down. That will force it to stay vertical or within one of a range of angles. And I'm going to draw a gradient up here, something a bit like that. So that has allowed me to preserve the detail in the sky. Let me just bring that up a little bit. So that's got me the sky, it's got me the brooding around the water, but unfortunately what it's done is it's also darkened down the tops of the groins. And that's a problem because we don't want to darken down the tops of the groins, but actually, because this is actually a picture, because the layer mask itself is just a picture, there is nothing stopping us painting into that picture. So I could go in here with something like a quick selection tool, and I can make a quick selection of those groins. So I'm just going to go along and draw the groins. All right, something, whoops, I've gone into the surf, which I don't want to do. And I've also gone into that, so approximately there. I'm going to click on that bit there. Hopefully you'll get the idea if I click on there. All right, so there's the groins. Our old friend select and mask. This time we want to refine the edge. Let's just make sure we've got a nice clean edge. And I'm going to apply a gentle feather, somewhere between half a pixel and a pixel, something like that. So we've now got a selection of just those groins. Now we know that if you have, we want to ensure that the curves effect is applied to those groins. And the curves effect is going to be enabled by white. So now if I select that as my target and go edit fill with white, then all of a sudden we'll find that the groins have now come back again. If we look at the layer mask, so again, alt clicking in there to get the layer mask, you can see what's happened is we've got the gradient, and now we have painted in white over the areas where the groins are. So that is allowing the curves layer to be applied to the groins, but not be applied to the area behind the groins. So that's the general idea. So that's using a gradient if you want to, and then combining it with the ability to edit the layer mask.
Ian,
Okay.
could you just answer one question again while you're there?
Sure.
Is there a way, somebody says, of showing the blown highlights as you can in Lightroom? I mean, I know there is.
Yes, there is. For any of the, there are various ways of doing it. There's never only one. One possibility is to add a layer that allows you to adjust them. So for example, a levels layer. And now if you hold the Alt key down, just like you can in the RAW converter, if you drag that to the left and hold the Alt key down, it will show you what is clipped in the highlights. And if you move hold the Alt key down, dragging the black slider, it'll show you what's clipped in the shadows. There is actually a layer specifically for this, and it's called a threshold layer. And this is sometimes quite useful. An adjustment layer called threshold, and what you can do now is you can change the threshold to be whatever value you like, and it will show you which pixels are above that brightness. So that is, in this case, we can tell there's nothing brighter than about 240, something like that.
Yeah. While you're in gradients, because it's much quicker than opening again, could you say about adding, can you add a gradient and then another one? Kathy
Right,
says,
yes,
hang
you
on.
can.
She always
Right,
cancels the first, so she doesn't.
That's a bit right. That's a bit right. So let's just pretend in this case we wanted to add a vignette, and we want to do it using gradients. Okay, there are other ways of doing it, but let's pretend we wanted to add a vignette and we wanted to do it with a gradient. So let's create a new layer, and we'll make a curves layer, and we will just darken down the midtones slightly. That's going to be the vignette that we have around the outside. Again, I'm going to change the blend mode to luminosity so we don't change the color. I'm going to invert the layer mask to be black. So this is, I think, the question. If we were to draw a gradient in white, the problem is every time you redraw, if you are redrawing a white to black gradient, it replaces all the pixels. However, if the gradient you choose is white to transparent, then this will give you the effect you want. Because where it is transparent, it doesn't draw any pixels. So now, for example, I can say I can draw there to there, and that will apply the vignette there. I can draw there to there, and that will apply it to the top. I can draw there to there, which will apply it to the right, and I can draw there to there, and it will apply it to the left. It's not a very good way of doing a vignette, but it demonstrates you can keep on drawing gradients, and it will keep on. If you use the black to transparent or white to transparent, it will work the way you expect it to work. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thanks. I think.
Okay. You think right? Let's move. Moving swiftly on. Right, where are we? I keep going too far. All right, another one. This is just showing same. I will show you a vignette. That's what I was going to show you with this particular image. This is as it came out of the raw converter. It's looking a little lacking in contrast, but I didn't want to blow out any of the deep shadow. This was taken, there was virtually no light at all, so it was taken in the blue hour. So how would we do that? We want to change the contrast, and we also want to add a gentle vignette to it. So changing the contrast, probably the best way of doing that is to use a curves layer. In this case, I'm just going to maybe just boost. Now it's way too much. And again, can you see that it's done horrible things to the color? So I'm just going to, where are we? Let's just, so something a bit like that. Change its blend mode to luminosity. You'll find yourself doing this time and time again. Because you do not want to, that's looking more like it. Now the problem is, having just done that, we have blown out, by losing the shadows, the darker parts of the picture. But we know how to get around that, because all we have to do is take a black paintbrush, again, go up, make sure black is our foreground color. In this case, I'm going to use something like 50% of the opacity. And I'm just going to paint over the areas where I don't want this particular curve layer to be applied. So I'm just going to paint over the areas where I want to bring the lightness back. So something a bit like that. Okay. So it's a way of, you can apply an effect to most of the picture and then take it away from some, or you can apply an effect and then just apply it to a little bit of the picture. It's a question of whether you think positively or negatively. You know, you paint in white on black or black on white. It swings and roundabouts, it doesn't matter. Okay, putting a vignette, the way I would normally do that is to, if I wasn't doing it in a plugin, would be to start off with a rectangular marquee. So I've got a rectangular marquee here. And my vignette wants to be approximately round that part of the picture, something like that. But clearly we do, oh, let me get the selection back again. Two things wrong with that selection. Firstly, it's way too abrupt. You do not want a rectangular box. You want it to fade off into the background. Secondly, this selection is a selection of the interior, not a selection of the outside. So you need to invert the selection. And to do that, you can go select inverse, or Command-Shift-I, Control-Shift-I is a way of having a selection all the way around. Now, you've got a choice here. You can either use select and mask and refine the mask now. So let's refine the mask here. So I'm going to now feather it, and I'm going to apply a very, very substantial feather. It's giving you a really good preview of how much feathering is being applied. So effectively, the bit that's in the middle is the bit that's going to be left alone, and the bit around the outside is the bit that's going to be vignetted. So I'm going to go, okay. And now what I have to do is apply a new layer. And this is going to be a curves layer, and I'm just going to pull the, there we are, just going to pull that down and change blend mode to luminosity. So that is applied. If I turn that layer on and off, you can see what the effect of the turning of that operation is. If you want to turn a layer mask off to show what the effect of the layer mask is, you can hold the shift key down and click within a layer mask, and that temporarily disables the layer mask. Very useful facility. Okay, so that's showing you what the effect of just that layer is without the layer mask. So it's showing you that we've recovered all that shadow detail there. Okay, so that's one way of doing it. There is another way. This is something that, let me go back. Where's my history window? Where's my history window? Go back to rectangular marquee. Here we are, select inverse. Okay. Now we're back to where we started from. We've got that selection. One possibility is to add something like a curves layer with that selection active. So we do end up with that horrible rectangular box. But what you'll notice is that if you click within a layer mask, you will now see the layer mask properties. And one of the things you can apply non-destructively is the feather. So we can now apply the feather as we go. And you can now push the feather until it looks right on the real picture. So no preview involved, and you can then go back and change your mind on the feather, which you can't do with the previous method. So two different ways of doing the same thing. That's how you might add a vignette onto a picture. Okay, now as promised, one of the lovely things about doing working with layers is that you can separate effects onto multiple layers. So in particular, this is something I do all the time, particularly with nature pictures. This is something that tends to affect us, and it affects sports photographers, as we tend to be working with long lenses, we tend to be working high ISO. And so if you look into an image, you often find that you've got quite a bit of background noise. And if you try and sharpen that image globally, not only will you sharpen the subject, but you'll also sharpen all the noise in the background. And you don't want to do that. Now, clearly there are some new tools out. There's things like the two new tools from Topaz. There's the Sharpen AI and Denoise AI. If you don't have that, or you don't want to use those, I still, even with those tools, I still like the idea of separating the two, because then you can choose which bits are sharpened and which bits are noise reduced. So let me just show you how you might do that using layers very quickly. So I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to use Nik Define here because it's a tool I know extremely well. So I'm going to use Nik's Define. It will create a blank layer initially on which to put the results of the denoise. So I'm going to wait for that. Oh no, I do not want to improve your proceedings. Please go away. Okay, so now what we have here is it's automatically choosing how much denoising to apply. I often find the defaults are a little bit high, so I tend to reduce them a little bit. I think it looks a little bit artificial having a completely featureless, very, very smooth background. So I like to have a little bit of texture there. So that's my denoise layer. I didn't even look at the detail. I've just applied a denoise layer. I'm going to hide that now because I don't want to sharpen an area that's already had detail taken away from it. So I'm going to hide that layer temporarily, and I'm going to use the raw pre-sharpener. Use whichever tools you like. You can use the noise reduction in Lightroom or in Photoshop, or basically it doesn't matter which tool you want. I'm happy to be using this. The principle remains the same. Now what I've got here is a globally sharpened picture. So the sharpening is now being applied to everything, including the background. And I think, hopefully you'll be able to see, it's made the noise really sharp. But the one thing we do not want is sharp noise. Okay, so we can play around with these settings. I'm just going to, for illustration, leave them exactly where they are, and I'm going to go OK. So we've now got, this is the point, we've now got two layers. We've got one layer which has got the sharpened image, and below that we've got the layer which is the noise reduced image. So if we apply a layer mask to the sharpened layer, we will see the layer that's below it, and the layer that's below it is noise reduced. Now, one of the things that has come into Photoshop recently, which is astonishingly good in a lot of cases, is a thing called select subject. So if I go select subject, let me make sure I've got the right layer first of all, and select subject, there we are. It's going to have a think for a while, and it has found the bird. So if you have a subject like a person or a bird or an animal against an obvious background, select subject will do the work for you. It's astonishingly good. All right, so it's done a basic selection. I'm going to go in and refine it. I'm going to push the radius up a little bit so it finds a good edge. I'm then going to feather it slightly so I don't want a really abrupt transition. And then go OK. So that has just made it a selection of the bird. And now, because the selection's active, if I hit this button here, which is the Create Layer Mask button, it will apply the layer mask. So there it is. If I look at the layer mask, Alt-click in there, that is the layer mask applied to the bird. Okay, and if we zoom right in, we have now got a sharp bird against a lovely smooth background. This is where it starts to get really nice, because what we can do now is, because we've got the sharpening on one layer and the noise reduction on another layer, we can apply a little bit of sharpening to the foreground. Not as much, but a little bit. So I can take my brush here. We know that if we paint white, then the sharpening will become visible. But I don't want it to be 100% white. So I'm going to paint in something like, shall we say, 20% white. So I can now go in here and I can just keep on painting around the foreground. And if you go in and zoom in and have a quick look, we are now applying a little bit of sharpening to that foreground. Okay, so this gives you the ability to, I'm actually painting in black, which nobody spotted. I certainly didn't spot it. So I'm now going to paint in white. That's rather better. That will actually apply some sharpening. It's one of the classic mistakes, is to paint black on black. All right, so there we are. Okay, let me show you something else as well while we're here. You can reuse the same layer mask. So if we wanted, in this case, I want the bird to stand out against the background. So because we've already made a selection here, I can just go Control-click in that area and just pick that selection up. And that just turns the layer mask back into a selection. And what I can do now is add another layer, say a curves layer. It's reapplying that same layer mask to it. And I'm just now going to, okay, spot the deliberate mistake. I should have inverted the layer mask. Let me invert the layer mask. That's what I want to do. Because now what I'm doing, let's get rid of the next stuff. What I'm doing now is, click on that one, is I'm just simply brightening the background and leaving the foreground untouched. Because these are now separate layer masks, if I don't want to apply the brightening to the base, all I have to do is paint in black, our old friend black. In this case, I'm going to paint in something like 50% opacity, choose that as the target, and just paint in black. And that will now restore the base to being relatively dark. And there you have the finished image, all being well. Let's just go back, something like that. So that's how you would apply multiple layers. So we've got one layer which is applying a noise reduction, another layer applying a sharpening, and another layer applying the applying a lightning effect.
Ian,
and yep.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I think this ought to be the last example. Is that fine? Okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was the only thing I was going to do was to illustrate the fact that you can actually use a thing called smart objects. I won't do another sharp noise reduce, but I will use smart objects. I won't work through it. I'll just show you this. This is just for illustration purposes. Actually, I'll open that one first just to show you what a smart object is. If you're happy with the concept of a layered document, so a layer with adjustments above it and things like that, and then saving it, you've got a PSD file, effectively. Now, if you take one of those files and you wrap it up, in like an envelope, if you like, a protective envelope, that becomes a thing called a smart object. And you can then apply things to that smart object completely non-destructively. So for example, I could take this layer and I could turn it into a smart object. You right click there and go convert to smart object. And it just does that it'll take a little while to do that one. Now, you can apply anything which is a smart filter to that smart object. So I can go, for example, go blur, and that will then bring up I didn't want a blur, I wanted something like a Gaussian blur. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur. Oh, I did it again. More haste. Gaussian blur. So what I can do is I can apply a blur. Yeah, a nice pleasing lack of definition in that picture. And you look at it and you think, I wish I hadn't blurred it quite so much. Now, obviously, if that had been done to the original pixels, you'd have lost the original pixels. But now all you have to do is double click on the Gaussian blur and you can come back and you can do it again. All right, so that's the principle of a smart object, is that you can protect one or more layers inside that smart object and then apply things non-destructively to it. So that's the principle of a smart object. So let me clear some of these. I think
Ian, that might be a subject for a future one. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
We are on just after.
We're on the time. I promised it. I haven't lived up to my promise, for which I apologise.
No, it's all right. I managed to interrupt you as usual.
Well, that's all right. Don't worry about that one.
Yeah, we had one or two questions, and we are just about on 5:30. So
okay.
I was just going to have a quick look and see if there were any that really haven't been. Somebody asked why you were editing original image rather than a copy with Lightroom adjustments, but I'm not quite sure what that was.
Well, okay, this is because I don't want it to take any. I would not. These are all PSDs. I would not normally apply adjustments to a PSD in Lightroom. I personally think that's a very bad practice. So I would always edit the PSD as the original, because then it would then go back as the original file. It's okay. All right. That's the main reason I would do that. If they were raw files, then obviously they would have the adjustments.
Okay. Somebody asked how sharpened the Photoshop Sharpen compares with Sharpen, but I think we did cover that a bit in the last one on sharpening. And it's basically the
Photoshop one is just useful where you want to put that little bit of extra sharpening selectively into very, very specific areas. That's what I'd use the Photoshop one for.
Okay. Somebody was asking about nature rules, but Jonathan's answered a little bit on that, and I think that might be a discussion
that's above my pay grade. I'm not going to comment on that one. Not every picture has to abide by rules either, which is I think it's important to understand techniques that you can just use for your own pleasure as well as for exhibitions.
Yeah, I mean, we can have a whole session on what is a nature image and things that we could go on for hours talking about that. So I think that's something. Let me quickly go over to see if there's any more. Yeah, I've answered that one. Do you need to flatten to print? Well, it depends what you print on, doesn't it?
No, you don't. One of the things when you save a Photoshop document, let me see if I can find that there is a setting that you ought to have, and it's under one of the preferences. So if I can find it, edit preferences, and it's in performance cursors. I think it's general. Excuse me, I'm looking. There is a setting which is called maximize compatibility. So if you spot it whizzing by, basically, if you have that setting, it may be under export. Ping none. No, it's not there.
Okay, we can look.
Anyway, the important thing is that if you have that set, what Photoshop does is it saves a flattened copy as a top hidden layer, and other applications will then pick that up. All right, so a lot of printing applications. Obviously, if you print from Lightroom or you print from Photoshop, you do not need to flatten. It's going to use the document as it stands.
Okay. One asked, which again I think is probably self-evident for for you, can you store that in Photoshop all the operations that you've done and go back?
No, it's the big difference between Lightroom and Photoshop. Photoshop maintains a history. You can adjust in your preferences how big that history is, because history just uses up lots of memory. And if you've got loads of memory, then you can save that. You can actually have a much longer history. But when you save the document, your history gets blown away. Unlike Lightroom, where the history is kept. It's a big difference.
I think, and the final one was about whether you used a mouse. Just quickly.
Sorry?
Whether you use a mouse or a graphics tablet.
I use both. I happen to use a mouse today because I want to do things very, very quickly. But if I'm doing a lot of painting, then I have a graphics tablet by the side of me as well, and I will tend to use the graphics tablet for that because it's pressure sensitive. So
Okay.
it depends what you're doing. But nowadays, yeah, certainly for today, I was using a mouse to keep it simple. What I don't use is a trackpad. For people that use a laptop, please get yourself an external mouse or an external tablet, because trying to do some of these operations by holding down certain keys and pressing forget it. It's that way madness lies.
Okay, I think I'm just going to sort of wind it up because people are obviously having to go elsewhere and logging out, and just say a very big thank you to Ian for this very informative talk. The chat is already full of people saying how useful it's been. You will all receive the link to the recording. I think you can also access the other ones. I think we're going to try and put up on the Nature Group website a link so that you can get to all our recordings. Otherwise, I would say the next event for the Nature Group is the Chairman's Day, and we will be sending you further details. There are some great talks scheduled for that. Again, I suspect we will not be actually attending it. We will be on Zoom. And otherwise, if you would like to let us know if there's any other requests you have for a Zoom meeting, I don't know whether we can ask Ian to do another one. I suspect he will probably say yes. He can say no now.
I never say no. No to you, Anne. You know that.
I know, it's good, isn't it? And you've still got all those women in your house and one more.
I've got a yip. You can probably hear the yipping dog in the background. So somebody's
Yeah.
obviously started cooking dinner because that's what she's doing.
Okay, so yeah, that was just great. So bye everyone, and you'll get a follow-up email with this link, and always pleased to hear any more questions. Ian will answer them eventually. So right, bye everyone.
Yeah, goodbye.
Bye.